Coming up on River City Presents, we'll be discussing the interwars period between World War I and II with Professor of History Brent Taylor. Welcome to River City Presents. My name's Daniel Hurt. Perhaps one of the most consequential periods in the 20th century is the period between World War I and II. A lot of the things that happened at the end of World War I ultimately led to World War II. I've often said it was a little bit before that if a bunch of art scholars had said that Hitler was a pretty good artist, that we wouldn't have the whole World War II thing. But to discuss this is Professor of History at WKCTC, Professor Brent Taylor. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks again.
So yeah, you're number 3. This is the 3rd time you've been on the program.
We call that the three-peat.
Yes. Did you like my reference with Hitler being an artist? If we just said that, hey, it's pretty good that we'd be.
I love that. People always look at that and they say, because he did. He didn't want to rule the world as a young man. He wanted to rule the art world, and so he goes off to art school.
I prefer this one.
Yeah. He goes off to art school, and people usually say, "Well, that's okay."
Yeah.
It's kind of like Motel 6 quality artwork.
If only they'd said it without the Motel 6, we might have been able to avoid the whole thing.
Right.
But today we're talking about a very volatile period, and a lot of things that happen at the end of World War I lead to World War II, and I just kind of set the scene with how it ends, how World War I comes to an end.
Right. So it was the war to end all wars. It was the largest war in the history of humanity to that point. Of course, with sequels, you have a bigger budget, more explosions, higher body count. That's going to be World War II.
Yeah.
With World War I, though, it was the ultimate. And they really meant it. They said that this was going to be the war to end all wars. And it's not just a catchphrase. They really thought, we've messed up big here. This is way worse than we've ever imagined a war could be. And we're really never, ever, ever going to do this again. It was kind of like when you wake up on Saturday morning and you're like, the Friday night was a little too rough. I am never doing that again.
And yet you did.
And then next week, you go back out, it's the same thing.
So there's trench warfare, poison gas, new weapons, disease, Spanish flu. All of that's new for the 20th century, right?
It's modern. And sometimes we put a little asterisk next to new because maybe some of these things had been developed a little bit during the 1800s, but they are all in full bloom for World War I in the 20th century. And you're right, it's a long list. You're talking about airplanes. You're talking about submarines. You're talking about tanks, which was a secret weapon developed by the British, and they wanted to hide it. And so they bury it down in the files as a water-carrying vehicle, which is a tank.
Oh, okay. So I did not know that. That's
right. And the list just keeps going.
Yeah.
Yeah. The list it goes on and on and on and on, and it's horrific, really. You add all this up, and this is not Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill anymore. This is death at every turn.
Because, essentially what would happen in trench warfare is they would ring the bell or blow the whistle, and then you'd get up and run into gunfire, and they would just mow them down. And that's why we have so many mass graves, like in the Somme and places, right?
Yeah, the way it was always explained to me was the general staff and the officers, the senior officers, had not caught up with the new way of war yet, because they were still fighting the Franco-Prussian War and whatever war came before this. So really, the way that used to work, if you had somebody in a defensive position, the way to root them out is you just charge. And that's where they blow the whistle, and they tell you to charge, and you hop up out of the trench, and you go for it.
And we'll meet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to do that.
We're going to meet at the razor wire in no man's land is what it's going to be. And they just kept doing it. We go back and forth because the other thing said, well, the enemy has attacked. You now have to follow up on this with a counter. So you strike while they're in disarray, and then they get mowed down. And then we're doing this back and forth.
You can kind of see how it seems sort of futile.
Yeah. 6-figure casualties at several of the battles.
But before the end of the war, there was something that happened in Russia, right? The Russian Revolution sort of takes place right toward the end, correct?
Exactly. So what's happening there is the Tsar wanted to keep the war going. The people did not. The Tsar was overthrown. Then they get in this republic. And it actually kind of looks like good news there for a minute because, hey, this is a war to end all wars, but it's also a war to make the world safe for democracy.
Woodrow Wilson.
Now, yeah, Woodrow Wilson. And now these tyrannies and despotism situations are falling, and now you're going to replace them. Well, then there's a civil war over control because of the power vacuum. And it turns out you've got the whites versus the reds. The reds are the communists.
The Bolsheviks, right?
Yeah, the Bolsheviks. And so they win that thing. And so now you got this whole Soviet system going on.
Which is a completely different thing that anybody's ever seen before. It's a very modern state that the structure of which has never been seen before, right?
It's a grand experiment in collectivism.
And they actually murder the Romanov family, right? Essentially, there's this famous moment, right?
The whole thing about the Marxist system, the communist system is, when you look at the propaganda, they don't like rich capitalists, they don't like priests in the church, and they also don't like kings and nobility. All these things are a source of conflict for them, or a rival for their power. And so you will see that kind of thing play out, where we're going to wipe out anyone who was associated with the last regime.
Obviously, the Soviet Union would go on to exist until 1991 or so, right? I mean, that ends up being a long Soviet empire. But at the end of World War I, the war ends. So talk about Germany's surrender. There are a couple of things. It's this German surrender and then the League of Nations, which was hoping to end all future wars. So let's start with the German surrender. So there's a train car involved.
Yeah, so the whole thing is, the American entry into that war really put pressure on Germany. Without that, maybe there's an off chance they can win because the Russian threat's been neutralized. Now you're just kind of dealing with France. France was in pretty bad shape too at the end of the war. They had some soldiers who were in revolt and these kinds of things. But when you put America in there, America's going to call up something like 4 million troops. And you're going to inject 4 million fresh troops into this. Germany and Austria and these places don't have another 4 million.
Sort of weights the scales.
It did. And at that point, we start pushing those battle lines back towards Germany. That's creating a political crisis inside Germany. The Kaiser wants to keep the war going. The people don't. And just like in Russia, the people won that little battle.
Talk about that.
So they overthrew the Kaiser. They kicked him out. They kicked the son out. So there goes the possible hope of succeeding at some point to the throne.
And they were related, right? The Romanovs and the Kaiser distantly.
Yeah, I believe that there's some distant relation there, because all the royal family is kind of related. The whole idea was you can't taint the royal bloodlines with someone outside the royal bloodlines. So instead of a family tree, we got a family pretzel.
Yeah, that is, and you can't go to war if you're all related. So you think, but
right, and then of course that doesn't necessarily hold up.
But back to Germany.
Yeah, so Germany, we're gonna surrender. The first thing is we have a new government. It's the Weimar Republic, and first order of business is we need to get out of this war. So we basically say, yep, we want to be out of the war. Where do we sign? You fast forward a little bit. That's the Paris Peace Conference, and at the Paris Peace Conference, we're going to sign all these different agreements about ending World War I. Separate treaties for all the different belligerent nations. And then the most important one is the Versailles Treaty, which is Germany signing with the Allied and associated powers.
So what are the consequences of that for Germany? And it's pretty tough. I mean, now I understand Woodrow Wilson thought differently than what most of the European powers did because we were a continent away. That could be part of it, right?
Exactly. You've got what you call the Big Four. So this would be Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George of England, George Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. And these are going to be the Allied or the associated powers who are determining really the future of a post-Kaiser Germany. And We get this treaty there. They all have different plans, just like you said. The Italians want territory. The British essentially want to make sure that they stay on top of the world power structure and that Germany's not threatening that.
Sure.
The Americans are there for kind of noble goals. Our whole thing is we want to essentially fix the world's problems. Woodrow Wilson comes from the progressive era, and the progressives are these social warriors and doers and fixers, and so we're going to fix warfare with this. War to end all wars, and we mean it.
That's going to be great.
It worked like a charm. And it's exactly his mindset going into this. Then you've got France, and the whole thing with France was they simply said, we want to make sure that Germany is never, ever, ever strong enough to do a second world war.
Revenge, more or less.
Yeah, and cutting them down to size. So you put all these guys into a room, and dealing with this is going to be pretty difficult. There's not a lot of overlap there, especially between the European and American viewpoints. There's some overlap in the European viewpoints, but if you throw Wilson in there, that's not going to work. And plus, he's got a 14-point plan for peace.
And I know one of the things about Wilson is he's always got a plan, and there's that utopian-esque mindset of sort of the progressive movement of that time. So they really thought with the League of Nations, which I suppose is kind of like a precursor to the United Nations,
Exactly.
right? They really thought they could figure out a way to end combat, but then Wilson gets sick. He has a stroke, right, trying to sell it.
That's going to be a little bit later on. We get through the entire process over in Europe. The problem is presidents do not have the power to just sign any agreement in a foreign country and come back home and say, well, here's the deal. It has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate.
Right.
And that's where the sales job is going to come in. And the Senate didn't like the looks of the treaty. They said in particular, there was Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. They didn't want that because they said, this looks like it's turning our foreign policy over to some international body.
So we were pretty isolationist at that time because it sounds a lot like Article 23 of the UN Charter.
Very isolationist, very isolationist. We are simply following the long-standing tradition of George Washington, which is no foreign entanglements. And in fact, if you look at cartoons from that time period where they're making fun of all this, you'll see references to foreign entanglements and how Wilson is trying to get you married and this shotgun wedding, and they don't want it. That's exactly right.
And ultimately, of course, later the UN does exist, and we sort of become, Wilson's vision for that ultimately does become a thing, though.
Yeah, that's a little bit more of a post-World War II story.
Right, right.
In the middle there, the League of Nations was struggling to kind of exist and to be relevant. We never did join it, though, because we couldn't get it through the Senate.
And then, of course, that would ultimately probably lead to its collapse. The lack of
Yeah,
US
that was a big
involvement.
problem with it, simply because you got one of the big four not signing on.
So what about the Treaty of Versailles? Now, all of this, it's quite controversial, at least for the Germans, because the screws are really put to them, right? So what all can they not do now?
A lot of stuff. That's a very, very long list. If you look at the Versailles Treaty, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles, all dictating what the post-World War I Germany is going to look like. And it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stipulations. It's things like we're going to cut down the size of the army. We are going to specifically limit the number of officers you can have in your army. We're going to limit the number of battleships you can have. We're essentially making Germany so small it can't attack France and win, is kind of one of the things that you could look at it as. So many other things.
And war debt, right?
War debt is actually one of the two big ones. So when you get to Article 231, so forget the first 230 articles.
Nice.
Which the Germans also don't like. You get to Article 231, that's something called the War Guilt Clause. And it essentially says in there that Germany accepts the responsibility for all this loss and damage caused to the Allied and associated governments during the period of belligerency, the war. So that's kind of like the Pottery Barn thing. you break it, you buy it. So you're accepting blame, and now the Allied governments are expecting you to pay.
But it's like an inconceivable amount of money, I would imagine.
Right, that's Article 232. So Article 230, yeah.
So you're paying, but now we're going to tell you how bad it's going to be.
Almost. There's actually a catch on that too. But Article 232 says, now that you've established the blame in 231, we now expect that Germany will make reparations for all the loss and damage caused during the period of belligerency. And there's also going to be interest payments on these things. So we're going to charge you interest on top of the original amount.
You're never getting out from underneath that.
Correct. And then the really big thing is, it says this amount shall be determined by the Reparation Commission.
So somebody else gets just to pick a number.
Correct. A random number that you are not aware of at the time you signed the contract.
$50 cajillion, you know?
Yeah. So when they finally did
It's
add
like
it all
Dr.
up.
Evil.
Right. Yeah. $1 billion.
That's right.
And in fact, it was $34 billion.
That's a lot of money in 1918.
In 1918, $34 billion is an unreasonable mountain of money. An unbelievable amount.
So let me ask you this. What if the shoe's on the other foot? What if this is happening to the U.S. or Britain? How are we going to like that? I just feel like that we're in a position where we're putting the screws to them but not really thinking about the
That's the whole
consequences.
thing. If you come along and let's say you're just a big supporter of Germany at home in Germany somewhere, you're going to see a lot of things there that are arguably unfair. And maybe even less than arguably unfair. Maybe even obviously unfair. And the way I always put this to people is, there's a reason that you're going to agree to all this. That government's going to be unpopular.
Yeah.
That government's going to be perceived as not governing very well. And then you get to have the armchair people come along later. Maybe a guy with a little mustache and big ideas.
Yeah. Former artist who couldn't go to art school.
Former artist who dropped out of the art school. And he's going to be able to say, in a very common sense way, we were hurt by all these provisions.
And that government looks weak for accepting those terms, too.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So let's sort of dive into that a little bit. So Hitler served in World War I.
Correct.
And then was in jail, and then he wrote his manifesto, more or less.
Yes.
So walk us through that and how he ultimately gets where he goes.
Okay, so you're right. Started out small. Basically what happened was they got out of the war and felt betrayed. So these are some former soldiers. They later even went on as far as to say they could have won the war. Now that's really debatable. But when you're looking back at it from 10 years out, you can at least say to yourself, you know what, we could have won that war if only we didn't have a bunch of people who were soft, who were in our way. There was this strike that was depriving the soldiers of some stuff they needed out in the front, as an example. You know, if only we didn't have that kind of stuff going on, we could have won that war, they said, kind of rewriting the history later. So they get into politics. And so Hitler joins this thing. Over there, they don't have the two-party system. They got multiple parties. So he joins this party, and he's the 7th member of it.
The National Socialist German Workers' Party.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he's the 7th member. And at first, there's just like this little club. They sit around. They do these speeches. The movement grows a little bit. It gets up to about 20,000 people or so, which is still small. Still very, but it's noticeable.
Right.
You've come somewhere.
You could get a share of the votes in the chancellor.
Potentially, depending on where your 20,000 of support is. And then you say, well, okay, we're getting impatient with all this. Let's make a move on seizing the government. And that's something called the beer hall putsch. It's really funny.
Which doesn't work out too well.
Didn't work out very well, but it's this giant beer hall. It's kind of like the Mall of America, but for drinking beer. And you go in there, and he produces this pistol, and he fires it in the air. He's like, the National Revolution has begun.
Okay.
Horrible disaster. They all get rounded up.
Just because you announce it doesn't make it so.
That's what happened there. He got tried, and I think this is where Germany made a pretty serious mistake. Because as a nation, you have to think, well, how serious was this? And apparently they didn't take it very seriously because he got a 9-month sentence.
Oh, he's out in no time. He's on vacation.
Yeah. And in fact, it actually turns out that 9 months off is the perfect time in which to write your next book.
Nice.
And so he's in there writing Mein Kampf from prison.
We gave him a typewriter and a chair and said, here, have some food, a nap, and write your book. There
And leisure time enough to get this thing finally. Because like Nixon said, you have to have an iron butt to write a book.
Right.
Or you have to be in jail for 9 months.
And then, of course, he gets inspired by something that happens in Italy around this time, too. So there's this fellow named Mussolini who's figured out that nationalism is a better tool than maybe socialism or other methods.
Yeah, he was a socialist.
Yeah.
And then he worked on this doctrine of fascism.
Talk about that. What is that?
So with fascism, Mussolini actually wrote the definition of this for us. It was published in, I think, in an Italian encyclopedia, something like that. And in it, he describes all these theories that he's got about government. And primarily, the number one theme you see in there is action. That this will be a government of action. They criticize democracies, for example, and republics. They say, look, this is a regime ruled by many kings. You've got 50 governors, you have 50 state senates, you have a Supreme Court, you have 435 representatives, you have 100 senators, you have a president, a vice president.
Too many middlemen.
Local mayors. That's chaos. What if you could cut through all that red tape? You put the decision-making power in the hands of a Mussolini, a Il Duce, the leader, and you just let him get stuff done.
Cut through the red tape.
Yeah. At least he made the trains run on time was always kind of like the catchphrase.
Yeah, I remember I've seen this news reel of a tornado or some storm damage, and the news reporter says something like, if you look at the way that Benito Mussolini's handling that, he's cutting through the red tape, he doesn't have to worry about passing legislation, he's just getting it done and they're doing it. And, you know, if you're somebody who's dealing with what is economic crisis on the horizon, or you feel like you're in a weakened position as a country, you like this idea of a strong leader, almost Friedrich Nietzschean sort of strong man. So that's got to be appealing to those folks, right?
It's very appealing, especially when there's a record of results. And you will notice when you study the Central and Eastern European dictatorships that they did get things done. And that's very alluring and very compelling.
I mean, we even in New York City had a rally in 1940 for the Nazis in Madison Square Garden. They filled the whole hall. So, I mean, it wasn't just a European thing either, right? Like there was some...
Right. Now, the American movement was always pretty small, but you could find people who were at least kind of flirting with the idea of fascism.
It's just fascinating to me that, you know, we think of it as just a European movement, but it did have global roots. But Hitler did not invent fascism, and I think that is something that we ought to make sure we say, simply because I think that often gets misunderstood.
Yeah, and if you want a way to remember that, the root origin of that was something called the Foscase. That actually has Roman origins, ancient Roman Empire. It was an axe with a bundle of rods tied around it, which was a symbol of authority. The top people in that government had that thing. And so it's kind of like your FBI badge today.
Yeah.
They flash that, you know that they're the real thing. And so we call this movement fascism, kind of looking back at the glory days of Italy.
Right. The ancient Roman days, yeah.
Yes. We're going to rebuild a modern Roman Empire, is what Mussolini was after.
So something else while this is all going on at the same time, back to Russia, Lenin has died at some point in the mid-20s, 23, I think. And doesn't he basically say, hey, whoever takes over after me, don't let it be that Stalin guy?
Yeah, there was a power struggle there. primarily Trotsky on one hand and Stalin on the other. And Stalin did, in fact, win out, and then he was ruthless, absolutely ruthless, purging out the party. And then eventually, Trotsky's going to end up dead. And so now here's another dictator, but interestingly enough, this is from the left. You had these other right-wing dictators, but now this is a left-wing dictator.
Yeah, and he was ruthless, and you talk about results. One of the things that certainly goes without mentioning is the modernization of farming. He gets the name Man of Steel from that too, right? So talk a little bit about he does sort of, I think the phrase is, he does in a decade what we did in 30 years, I think is what they say.
Yeah, so their whole philosophy is central planning. We're going to make a 5-year plan and we're going to carry it out no matter what that takes. Could be ruthless, you could be using prisoner labor to build a canal. You might be sending prisoners to dig tungsten, whatever. They did all that, and it also got results. And what's really fascinating to me is we talk about right wing and left wing, but at a certain point, when you're on the spectrum so far, for me, they kind of meet up down here in Crazy Town.
The horseshoe effect, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, he sort of, it wasn't, I suppose it was about ideology, but it also seems to me it's just about power. He just wants to cement himself to where no one can imagine Russia without him. I mean, he's a cult of personality, right?
They achieved that, essentially. There's all this propaganda where people are marching arm in arm with Stalin. And
well, they're pretty posters.
they definitely did their artwork better than Hitler did his.
And one of the things, too, is like, I know that when they collectivized farming, like they inadvertently caused famine, too, right?
Oh, that is really bad. Especially when you're looking at the Ukraine. There's something there called the hidden Holocaust. And they send the experts in from the city to tell the farmers how to farm.
Sure, that goes over well.
It very much did not go over well. Next thing you know, there is this famine. Because one thing is, they set artificial limits for, okay, this is the target of how much wheat we're going to harvest this year. And then 3 years from now, we're going to harvest this amount of wheat. And then when you don't meet the grain quotas for whatever reason, now the government is upset with the people who are supposed to be providing the grain. And they say, well, why are you holding out on us? And we're going to begin this process of grain requisition, which is, we know you're storing wheat here somewhere. We're going to find it.
Okay.
And if they kick your door in and realize you've got a loaf of bread, they say that's part of the requisition.
And you're going to the gulag, potentially.
And potentially you go to jail or worse, and then they take the wheat. And what happened was Ukraine was starving. And there was lots of evidence about this, firsthand testimony. So one thing was that next spring, you don't hear any birds.
Huh.
You talk about silent spring, that's because they ate all the birds.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's
a rough one.
I also heard that they, in rebellion, some of them killed their own animals so the state couldn't seize the property.
There was a lot of jealousy over that kind of thing because they're going to come in and collectivize your farm. They also collectivize your horse. And people get really attached to their animals.
And their property.
Yeah, well, property, but also animals.
Yeah.
And you'll definitely see that was one of the biggest resentments. Maybe take my land, but don't take the horse.
But the whole process of collectivization, I suppose, under state control would be something that would be hard to be adjusted to if you were the average everyday Russian who probably didn't have a lot to begin with.
Very difficult. And then, of course, they turn people against each other. They've got this term kulak, which is, I guess a loose translation would be like rich hotshot. And so if you get accused of being a kulak, you're in bad shape. They're going to kind of descend upon you, and it's not good.
So, and I'm assuming some modern technology is coming along prior to World War II as well. So what is Russia doing while Hitler is sort of in the Nazi party? As they're both advancing through the 1920s, what's going on with both of those powers? What are they doing?
They are eyeing each other suspiciously. So when you read Mein Kampf, you go in there and he'll say very specifically that Germany's future is to the east. Well, that's Russia.
Well, yeah, if you're Russia, you're like, so that's me.
Yeah, wait a minute. But then at the same time, they're also playing footsie with each other. And there is a point in history where, had this gone a slightly different direction, it could have been really bad for the world. They got on the same page about some stuff.
The non-aggression pact.
Exactly. Also known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And they're both looking at Poland because, in reality, Poland has not always been a nation. There were plenty of times when there was no Poland on a map, even though there were Polish people and everything else. So they were basically going to say, hey, what if we come in from one side, you come in from the other, and Poland just gets erased?
Right.
And that's the agreement.
So, but it's also, Hitler talked about having living space, right? It was called
Lebensraum.
Lebensraum, yeah.
Lebensraum. And the whole argument there was Germany had been cut down to size in World War I, lost all the colonies, so there goes that pressure valve, lost territory in Eastern Europe. And their argument was that these other nations are enormous. If you look at Russia, Canada, the United States, these kind of places, they're huge, and their populations are much smaller than that. And in Germany, their population density is too high.
Right.
And they're worried that they can't support all these people. So they want to take the land.
In the lead up to this, so they're not even allowed to build a military. So whenever the Nazis sort of predict the Depression in their own sort of way, right? Don't they keep saying catastrophe's on the way? It's sort of the talking point, and then they got lucky and it was.
Right. Well, and even before that, though, we can't forget that in the 20s, you had some more government mismanagement on the part of the Weimar Republic. Remember that they had the huge war debt.
Yeah.
And then somebody decided it would be a really great idea for us to just print the money we owe.
This is going to go really great.
Yeah. Hard lesson to learn. Money is a commodity, just like shoes or iPhones or anything else.
This is the wheelbarrows of money stories.
This is the wheelbarrows of money, 100% correct. They devalued that currency so much that crazy things were happening. It was taking stacks of money to pay for a cabbage.
I mean, can you believe going to the grocery store with a wheelbarrow you got out of your garage or something, and then like, here are 5 items I would like to purchase?
You're not kidding. I've seen photos of women shopping. They've got a basket full of vegetables over here, and they got a basket full of money in the other hand.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. And that, I mean, you can then very clearly argue we have been mismanaged.
And I think the average everyday person who has to haul that much weight into the store is going to say, not just because the economy's in bad shape, but you can physically see that this is a problem.
Exactly right.
And so that's the perfect material to capitalize on if you're Hitler and the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party.
That's exactly the thing that opens the door for Hitler.
So talk about how he comes to power.
All right, the beer hall putsch failed. He went to jail, and so now it's back out on the speaking circuit again. Only this time I've got a book.
They've let him, he's got more material to work with.
That's exactly right. And in the meantime, the party is kind of making some inroads.
He's got badges now. You know.
We've got. I tell you what, they've got messaging, and they've got optics, and they have the uniforms and
thanks to Goebbels,
the red colors, and masters of propaganda. They've got all that stuff in place, and they're just sort of chipping away at the other parties, because in that multi-party system, it's kind of wild.
And all you need is a majority coalition, right? You don't have to have
Yes. And that is in fact going to happen there. They're going to start working with other right-wing parties to then maybe try to get over into power. And then finally there's a 1932 election. Hitler's going to make the most of that. Let's run for president of Germany. So he ran for president of Germany, came up short. His party, however, did pretty well in the German legislature. So then there's this calculation. They have a dual executive system.
the chancellor and...
Yeah, they got a president and a chancellor.
Yeah.
So then what's going to happen is the president says, you know, his party's doing really well. We should probably then kind of co-opt his movement, kind of fuse it together with what we're doing.
If we put them in the same team, they'll all try to rise together.
Okay.
Put them on the team.
Yeah, we're going to bring him in.
I got it.
And maybe then that way he's kind of on a leash and everything too. There could be that kind of thinking there behind the scenes. So we appoint him chancellor. That's an appointed position at that time. And that was his foothold into the system. Not very long after that, the president, which was von Hindenburg, passed away. He was older. And they just didn't even really bother to replace him. They said, we got this other guy over here. He's the leader.
So was he that charismatic? I guess what we often lose track of is how charismatic was Hitler as a human being? I mean, when we think of him as the yelly, angry man in black and white film footage, that's not really accurate per se. The Germans actually saw him as quite a charismatic fellow, right?
Right. I mean, he did all that stuff, and some Germans even criticized it. I've seen some accounts where maybe they were kind of more like left-leaning Germans, and they said, "Man, this guy's weird. He does this whole staring thing, and then he's waving his arms and whatever." But a lot of people saw strength in all this, and especially the messaging. I mean, his messaging is pretty clear. We have not been run the way we need to be run as a country. We've got better plans. If you go with me, you will at least have two things, which is work and bread. This is the Depression era, global depression. The Depression was really hard on Germany. We had 25% unemployment. They had something like 40% unemployment.
Wow, that was 1 in 4 for us. So
yeah, devastating levels. Society threatening, civilization threatening levels of unemployment.
So it might not be surprising that you put your faith in one man to lead us through the darkness.
He at least says he cares about it and that he's got a plan to take care of it.
So let's give him a try. Yeah.
What else do you have to lose?
And you know, he talks about like making Germany strong as it was before the war, making us imperialist. He sort of invokes Rome even on his own, like Mussolini. So then, obviously, after time passes, there's the Reichstag fire. Is that really the...
Okay. That's the linchpin of how he's taking over. So the Reichstag is like the German parliament building. There's a fire in there, still very mysterious. We're not 100% certain what happened with that. The guy that got blamed for it had been kind of like a left-leaning guy. So they run with that. And they say, look, the communists are making a move. We can't allow that to happen. This is an emergency. We need emergency powers to deal with this insurrection.
It's a coup, yeah.
Yeah, there's a potential coup there. We're not going to allow that. Give me the power and I'll get to the bottom of it. Then once he got the power, game over. We're banning political parties. We're banning newspapers. Pretty soon you can't even criticize the guy.
And that's a pretty classic tyrant move, right? To capitalize on an event that you may or may not have started yourself and then use that to clamp down.
Yes. Yeah, you'll actually see that between Germany and Poland as well. The Germans will say, well, Poland's been infringing our frontier.
Yeah.
Can you believe that?
Our old historic borders, yeah.
Yeah.
So ultimately, he starts violating rules in the Versailles Treaty, aside from becoming a tyrant, and that upsets the Brits.
Yeah, so Versailles Treaty, that thing is persona non grata with Hitler. He does not like that at all. In fact, if you look at Mein Kampf, he's like, Versailles this, Versailles that.
We're going to tear that up when we get in there.
Yeah, who cares about that? This is something the British came up with, and the French. So then the British situation and the French situation is kind of tedious here. The dirty secret is nobody wants a second world war. So on one hand, you've got this guy who's misbehaving.
Everybody remembers it being catastrophic.
Of course. Is this guy misbehaving on one hand, and on the other hand, like, do you really want to try to do something about it? Because we've seen what that looks like. And so there is some thinking that if you just work with Hitler from an international perspective, you can get him satisfied, you can get a few of these things changed that he wants changed, and then everybody's happy again.
Appeasement is what that comes to be.
And the fancy name is appeasement.
And Neville Chamberlain, I jokingly say it's kind of like someone says, hey, you can have that, but you can't have, well, right, you can have that too, but you can't have that. It's a little more complicated than that.
It's really not more complicated than that.
So it really is kind of like...
I've always looked at it as kind of like the impulse buying line at the grocery store. And the kid sees it because it's right there at eye level, begs mom, hey, I want this. And mom's like, no, you'll ruin your supper.
But I want it.
But I want it. And then eventually maybe it happens.
Yeah. So Chamberlain goes to see him, and he sort of, well, first he invades the Sudetenland, right, which is the historic territory that they had taken from them.
Yeah, so there was a pretty high population there, Sudetenland, and well, that's seen as a crisis. Germany doesn't need to be on the move like this, so let's go and talk to the guy. So we have a meeting in Munich. Chamberlain's there, Hitler's there. We're going to talk
Germany.
it out.
We're just putting it back together. It's all right.
Of course. That's all the are. And then the British are like, well, kind of who are we to say that you shouldn't own that, and especially since we don't want another war. And so they let them have it. And then the assumption is, well, but now you're happy, right? Now you're satisfied. You've got what you want.
I'm good. Yeah.
And so the Germans basically, yeah. Well, they turn right around. They're invading a place called Memel, which nobody ever heard of before. And so again, it's like it's happening over and over again. There's this pattern. But what do we do?
We just say, well, maybe if that's where the borderlines will stop, hopefully he quits there and we don't have to do anything. What seems that the Western allies do is keep drawing red lines and then keep moving the red line.
That's the way it worked until they finally drew one line too many, which is Poland.
Right.
They drew that line and they said, okay, we know you've really done a lot here, but do not touch Poland.
So if you're Hitler at that point, do you just assume that they're going to let you have that too? Or does he know that this time they mean business? Because Chamberlain's basically, what is it? He comes home and he's holding up that big piece of paper.
Peace
and he's
in
like,
our time.
he promised me that it was going to be.
Yeah.
But the problem is you can't do that. You can't trust that.
That's the thing. And you think there's probably some calculation there that says maybe we do this and get away with it too. And at the same time, there's also a calculation that, you know what, we'll just turn the armies towards France and finish them off if they want to get too tough about it.
Because they did a pretty good job before, so they could reasonably assume that that's something that could be done again.
And in fact, Germany has been kind of sharpening its knives ever since World War I. They realized that they were on the clock. They kind of ran out of time to try to get to France and defeat Paris and all this. So we're going to build our army on speed. It's going to be a quick thrust.
It's like 4 years, right?
Yeah, lightning strike, blitzkrieg,
Yeah.
lightning war. And really they did a pretty good job of adapting in that regard. Much more successful in France the second time around.
And then, of course, the fateful moment, Hitler and the Russians invade at the same time, right? Like that plan before.
They did the plan. They each took half of Poland, and now they're good. Now Poland is gone. They each got part of what they wanted.
Ultimately, that leads to the British and declaring war, right? And then ultimately, that's the ball game.
Yeah, once Poland happens, that's it. England and France declare war. There's actually what's called the Phony War Period. It was 6 months of dropping leaflets over Germany explaining that they're committing acts of war in case they weren't sure.
So it probably just like gave them enough toilet paper for the war or something.
Right. Let's build a few more tanks until this thing heats up. But then once 1940 gets there, it's really on. That's a full-blown Second World War.
And obviously we can do World War II on another episode, but it really does become, it's just fascinating to me that because of the things that happened at the end of World War I and all those people and all those pieces coming together, it really does sort of, it's also consequential, right? So
World War I is hard to undersell. It's the entire century, all in one little ball. The Soviets, World War II, the whole century there, all those struggles begin with World War I.
It's crazy to think about how one war can influence the rest of the century all the way up into the 90s, because the Soviet Union, of course, lasts all the way up until then. And the Cold War and the technology and all of that sort of stems from that period.
Sure.
Well, it's just fascinating, and I appreciate you coming on the show and talking with me about this. I'd love to have you back a fourth time if you'll come back, and we'll do it.
Anytime.
All right, that was my guest, Brent Taylor, Professor of History at WKCTC. We'll hope you'll join us next time.